Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to WITA's 2023 Washington International Trade Conference. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's online program, and we're pleased you can be with us again today, whether you are in person or online. For those of you on Zoom, reminder that if you have to log off and log back on, just use the same link that was sent to you this morning and you can come right back in. For those of us who are here in the Reagan Building, welcome. We're delighted you can join us back here in person. This is the first time we've been back here since 2020. We've had several other events, but the first time the conference has been back in person since February of 2020, so we're delighted to have so many of you back with us today. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that today is Valentine's Day. And in case you missed it, it also means it's Trade Valentine's Day. That's hashtag Trade Valentine. So please don't forget to post those on Twitter today with hashtag WITC 2023. For those of you who are in the room, we'll pass out some heart-shaped note cards, and you can write your Trade Valentines on those, and our staff can post them on Twitter for you if you'd like. If you have time, we'll try to read some of those as well during the break. To introduce our very first speaker today, I'd like to welcome back to the stage Maria Ziba, Vice President of International Affairs for the National Pork Producers Council and a member of WITA's Board of Directors. Maria?
Good morning, everyone. So nice to see everyone in person. I have this distinct honor and pleasure of introducing Senator Crapo from the wonderful state of Idaho. Senator Crapo has been a champion of free trade for a number of years, and we are very excited to see him as ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. We're also really excited to welcome him because this is his first appearance to the international trade community here in Washington, D.C. at a WITA event. On a personal note, I'm really happy that he is able to join us. I represent over 60,000 plus U.S. pork producers, and he has been a great champion of pork, but also U.S. agriculture. So on behalf of the U.S. ag community, we want to welcome him as well and wish him luck, and hopefully we can pass new free trade agreements. That's what the pork industry and ag always wants, but with that, I do want to welcome him and look forward to joining him on the stage. Steve and Senator Crapo, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. I appreciate the chance to be here with all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to use my brief introductory remarks to indicate a very strong disagreement with the direction in our current trade policy in the United States, and then we can discuss that in the panel, I'm sure, as we move forward. Freedom has always informed my thinking on trade. First, because Americans are entitled to freedom, and second, because Americans excel when they are given more freedom. We can maximize freedom for Americans by increasing opportunities to reach overseas customers, including by negotiating for better market access and enforcing our trade rights. The current administration criticizes as a 20th century notion the idea of comprehensive, congressionally approved market access agreements. In fact, in its various initiatives and frameworks, we see no meaningful discussion of market access, of enforcement, intellectual property protection, investment rules, or resolution of technical barriers to trade. In fact, I would argue that such true trade agreements are more of an 18th century idea, since the Declaration of Independence attacked King George, among other reasons, for cutting off America's freedom to trade with the world. History has proven the idea to be worthwhile, particularly in the 20th century, where President Eisenhower challenged Congress to support his call for a more open trading system. He said, if we fail in our trade policy, we may fail in all. Our domestic employment, our standard of living, our security, and the solidarity of the free world are all involved. Ike was right. And he is still right today in the 21st century. From 1950 through at least the first 16 years of this century, trade expansion increased U.S. GDP by $2.1 trillion, or more than $18,000 per household. Over this same period, we strengthened relations with allies and enhanced our economies. Clearly, we should not support just any trade agreement. We need bold, impactful trade agreements, and they can be won only if we are prepared to walk away from the mediocre ones. We must push for the bold agreement because we need prosperity and international support more than ever before. Last year, inflation stole an average of $5,000 from every U.S. household. Even exports in competitive sectors like U.S. agriculture are expected to fall this year in comparison to last. Meanwhile, China is aggressively negotiating new agreements to secure better access for its producers. Today, we need no foreign monarch to cut off our freedom to trade. We're losing that freedom ourselves by simply sitting on the sideline of the international trade arena. Rather than confront China's abusive trade practices, the administration is unfortunately emulating it by adopting a debt-financed industrial policy for us at home, which will add trillions to the U.S. national debt. This is a huge mistake. Competing with China on irresponsible spending is a race that everyone will lose. So what does a bold American trade agreement that increases our freedom look like? For a start, a bold agreement expands opportunities for as many Americans as possible by including commitments for farmers that gets rid of protectionism disguised as safety measures, for innovators that makes sure fruits of their creativity and research will be protected, for service providers, including those in the digital sector, that ensures they do not face discriminatory taxes or data localization restrictions, and manufacturers that recognizes our products, standards, and testing approaches as equivalent to our trading partners. However, no matter how bold the trade agreement, its success depends on our ability to enforce its rules. Even here, the administration is taking a page from China's playbook by allowing long-established trade rules to atrophy. For example, the administration, without any evidence that it might help end the pandemic, waived the American intellectual property rights under the WTO TRIPS agreement. Critically, and closer to home, the administration has been lackluster in enforcing the USMCA. Countries watching our inaction are emboldened to adopt even more discriminatory measures, particularly for products and services where Americans are highly competitive. If the administration wants to continue to take a timeout on trade, then Congress will step up, and in a bipartisan fashion. There is bipartisan support for true trade agreement negotiations, and America needs to get engaged. As the branch closest to the people, members of Congress can verify something else that Eisenhower said is true. History does not long entrust the care of freedom to the weak or the timid. We know the American people are neither, and thus deserve a better trade policy. I look forward to working with my congressional colleagues to accomplish just that. Thank you very much. I'll be right back. It's great.
I'd like to welcome to the stage my good friend and the president of WITA's board of directors, Steve Lamar, who's also president of and a CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Ken. And thanks, Senator, for those great opening remarks and really keeping our trade conference really, I think, at the forefront of the discussions today. So I've got a couple of questions for you, and if there's time, we'll toss it to the audience as well. But just to kind of talk about some of the big issues that we have here. So last year, you helped craft a trade package that was approved by the Senate 91-4. And just 91-4, that's a really important number. This is impressive in any year. Last year, I think it was heroic. And do you have any hopes you can repeat that same feat this year?
Yes, I do. And I have to give some credit to my colleague, Senator Wyden, in the Finance Committee. We negotiated that bill together. That's why it got 91 votes. It was bipartisan. And I believe that we can get there. Trade is not a partisan issue and should not be. And even though my remarks were stern today, there is broad support in the Congress for us to get engaged in serious trade negotiations to protect and enhance our trade policies and our economy. And a couple of examples. I believe that you'll recall that the MTB and GSP were a part of that agreement. Yet we did not get that pushed through in the China bill that we did last year, partly because of some partisan battles on completely unrelated trade issues, efforts to push, frankly, social policy and environmental policy into MTB and GSP provisions. But we can get past that, and we can get there. I recently, in the past year or two, did a trip to the Indo-Pacific with a number of my Senate colleagues and House colleagues. And we focused on trade in much of those discussions. And the nations surrounding China in the Indo-Pacific are eager for us to pass MTB and GSP because they want to be our trading partners. They want to expand their economy and their strength with us. But if we don't do it with them, they will have to move to China. And China is openly courting them. And this is one of the reasons why we need to have such an important endeavor in Congress to get at least these measures enhanced and to move forward. We can go into other areas as well, but we've got to get engaged in true trade agreements and expanding our trade policies. In this case, simply reauthorizing our trade policies that have expired to help give a confidence level to our trading partners around the globe.
Thanks. I want to come back to those trade policies in a second, but you opened the door to the Indo-Pacific and talked about some of these other initiatives. So, so the administration has launched a number of initiatives. And I think I'm going to get them all, I hope. The IPEF, the APEP, the TTC, there's the US-UK dialogue, the US-Kenya Strategic and Investment Partnership. They obviously met last week. The US-Taiwan Initiative. These are all address a range of very, very important topics, but none of them are free trade agreements, as a lot of us have talked about. What do you make of this focus? And then what role will Congress have in providing oversight on these initiatives once they come to an agreement of some sort, because they aren't likely going to require congressional approval?
Well, you've raised a couple of very interesting issues there. First of all, whether they're called a framework or an initiative, or there are a lot of other names, they are not trade agreements. They are not trade agreement negotiations because they don't contain, as I mentioned, market access. We're not hearing discussion of market access. We're not hearing discussion of enforceability, intellectual property, investment rules, technical barriers to trade, product standards. And this is what needs to be discussed. So I'm very concerned about this new dynamic. As I indicated in my opening remarks, the administration has refused to engage in trade agreement negotiations. And with regard to what they have done, they've tried to justify it as I don't quite know why they justify not going into trade agreements, but they've tried to say they don't even know for sure whether they have to go to Congress for approval of them, which means they must not contain sufficient policy to require congressional approval. And I just think this is just a huge battle that we are in right now. We have not agreed, and by the way, you'll recall there was a bipartisan letter that went to the administration about these initiatives and frameworks and so forth, saying that we expect them to be submitted to Congress. This is Republican and Democrat on the Finance Committee believe these negotiations, whatever they are, should come to Congress. Part of that is an effort on our part to tell them they need to expand the content of these negotiations to be something worthy of requiring congressional approval. So a lot of battles, if you will, are going on here, struggles. I'm not saying that what's being discussed in these initiatives and frameworks is not important. It is, and it's important for them to be as successful as possible. But we've got to get to the really solid meat of the topic of trade negotiations for us to really get the kinds of results we need.
So, on a related note, Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, and this governs, free trade agreement negotiations, but also sets the guardrails for administration, congressional consultations on trade. It has been expired for a couple of years now. Do you see any opportunity to see that renewed?
Well, it was discussed quite a bit last Congress, and I got this question from reporters and many others throughout the last 2 years. My response every time was, I think there is an opportunity for Trade Promotion Authority to be discussed and perhaps to be authorized by Congress again, but there has to be a trade agreement being negotiated for there to be Trade Promotion Authority granted. That's what we're talking about here. And as long as the administration refuses to actually engage in trade agreement negotiations, I don't think you will see much interest in Congress to even get further into the debate over Trade Promotion Authority. And I want to be clear about this. I do believe that there is a real place for negotiation and the adoption of Trade Promotion Authority in the right circumstances. But right now, I don't believe that there is a will in Congress to get very far down that road until we see some kind of action on the part of the administration to get engaged in trade negotiations. And one other piece of this, we need consultation too. With regard to all of the initiatives and frameworks and so forth that are going on right now, the amount of consultation that we are getting from the U.S. Trade Ambassador and the administration is significantly less than we have received on previous true trade negotiations. If you could compare what happened under the USMCA trade negotiations, the Trump administration put out far more consultation with Congress than we're getting now with regard to these various initiatives. And until we start getting that consultation and being treated as the branch of government under the Constitution that approves trade negotiations, I think you're going to see very little support in Congress for moving further into TPA.
So I'd mentioned before I wanted to come back to the GSP and MTB, and what do you see? What hope do you see from Congress in taking on these programs? GSP, MTB, TAA. Again, these expired programs. Are you worried also that the lengthy expiration of the GSP program might be sending a bad signal for some of the upcoming trade preference programs that are expiring? There's AGOA, there's Haiti. I'm curious your thoughts on what kind of activity we can see this year.
I do believe the fact that Congress has let these programs expire, these policies expire, and that it has lagged for a while now is creating some bad signals. I do not believe, however, that should create a signal that they do not have broad support in Congress. As you mentioned, the 91-4 vote that included them in the last Congress. The point, however, is that they have been pulled into other negotiations. I mentioned earlier the environmental negotiations, the social policy negotiations that are going on. And somehow we have to get past that. But the bottom line here is that it's regrettable that we have let these expire, and Congress needs to take action quickly and swiftly to get them through. I do believe TAA is in a different position. Both MTB and GSP are very strongly bipartisan supported provisions in our trade policy. TAA has generally been more of a partisan issue. It's one that the Republicans have resisted, but which they have agreed to in the context of agreeing to a trade agreement. And so once again, to get back to my point, I know I sound like a broken record here, but if there were an actual trade agreement before Congress, I think that you would see an openness on the Republican side to agree to or to look at the issue of trade adjustment assistance in the context of that trade agreement.
Yeah.
But until there is such a trade agreement, you're not going to see much willingness. There was a push last Congress for us to simply extend TAA and, in fact, put it on steroids with significant enhancements with no trade agreement to accompany it. And that was resisted, as you saw. And it will continue to be resisted. So TAA is in kind of its own separate category. I think it's something that's achievable in the context of trade agreement or ratification.
So in your remarks, you were talking about the intellectual property issues with, like, for example, the TRIPS waiver with respect to COVID vaccines and concerns about whether the administration's included intellectual property in negotiating mandates for, various trade initiatives. What should the U.S. trade policy be with respect to intellectual property?
Well, the U.S. policy should be to protect our intellectual property. And right now, I don't believe the administration has given us a legitimate explanation as to why we should not do that. I mean, why we should have given the TRIPS waiver, and why, if you move into the tax arena, in the OECD negotiations, that we should be much stronger in protecting our intellectual property rights from being our digital trade from being taxed by other jurisdictions. And the bottom line is I continue to hope that we will get to where we can do so. But whether it's the tax negotiations or whether it is the trade negotiations right now, we're not getting a lot of consultation from either the Treasury Department or the U.S. Trade Negotiating Office on either of these contexts. We keep pushing, but we get very little response.
So you brought up China as well, and yesterday we had a lengthy session in the first day of our conference about China, and of course, U.S. competition with China is on everyone's mind. What do you think we can expect from Congress this year on China?
Well, first of all, I believe that, and particularly in the House, although I believe this will also occur in the Senate, you're going to see a lot of hearings and working committees to do the oversight, to understand exactly what's going on and how we should respond to it on everything from not just trade policy, but tax policy and, frankly, national security issues. And those hearings, I think, are going to be probably the biggest focus right now. There's going to be a lot of push, which you're seeing from me here today, to get us to be engaged with China on trade. And I don't mean just with China. There are trade issues with China, but with the Indo-Pacific. And as I indicated, the people, the countries who live or who are in the Indo-Pacific around China, all are eager for us to get engaged. And so I think you will see some increased efforts to try to get us there. And it all comes back to what I started my remarks with today. In the trade arena, and of course in the tax arena, we're having the same kinds of struggles and negotiations. But I think, unfortunately, I haven't seen a budge on the administration's part yet. And you're going to see probably a lot of battling right now in Congress until we can get all of ourselves more on the same page.
So yesterday we also had a great opening session talking about the WTO and dispute settlement issues. And in fact, the WTO technically will turn 30, I think, during this Congress on January 1st, 2025. So, I think everyone will agree that the WTO is at some sort of an inflection point. Ambassador Tai recently challenged some of the decisions, describing those as being on very thin ice when it comes to like the national security considerations. What ideas do you have to address some of these recent concerns or sort of help guide the conversation from a congressional perspective?
Well, there's really two pieces to that. One is, I think we all agree that WTO enforcement, excuse me, simply just takes too long. It is cumbersome, bureaucratic, and difficult. We've got to address the procedures to try to get more effectiveness in trade, in trade enforcement. I've mentioned that several times today. And one of the things, I can't tell you the specifics of how that needs to be done yet, but it needs to be done. We need to have a strong focus in trade negotiations on enforcement so that we can get the policies of enforcement made more efficient and streamlined. But secondly, we need to utilize them, the ones that we have. And I know it's fine to say that our trading partners are not utilizing them fairly. Well, we need to utilize them and utilize them fairly. And I believe that our own trade ambassador and her team need to be much more effective and aggressive at utilizing our trade enforcement options that we do currently have, which will help, I think, to advise us on how to proceed further as we get into the negotiations, if we can get into them, on improving the trade enforcement policies. But this whole question is just another piece of the whole point that I've been trying to make today, which is we've got to get into the negotiations so that we can get agreements with our trading partners that will then help fix the WTO problems and improve them.
Got it. I'm going to open up to see if there's any questions. I think we might have time for one question or so. I thought I saw one back there, but maybe not. So, Nicole.
Steve, why don't we take one over here?
Yeah, let's do that one. Okay, sorry, we got the microphone over there, so let's do that.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for being here. I'm Rory with Autos Drive America. There's been a lot of policies around the world, including the U.S., that have seemed to be kind of incompliant with trade policies. You know, carbon border adjustment, policies around electric vehicles. How can we use trade policy to support greener trade without stifling trade in general?
With regard to climate issues?
Yes.
Well, first of all, let me tell you the wrong ways to do it. In my opinion, it's wrong to attack trade in traditional energy sources, which America has done. President Biden should not have shut down the Keystone Pipeline, should have enhanced our ability to get more aggressively engaged in expanding our U.S. natural gas resources and so forth. So we should not here at home try to, or undercut strong energy sources because of a disagreement on climate policy. It's also wrong, in my opinion, to adopt here at home carbon taxes that will raise the cost for consumers. There are things we can do to deal with it. But finally, it's very wrong to mirror the Chinese style of industrial policy by funneling hundreds of billions of dollars into distorted subsidies into different industries. Every Republican on the Finance Committee signed a letter last year warning that the electric vehicle credits in the reconciliation bill would alienate our allies at the very time we need to work with them, and that is exactly what happened. Those are the wrong ways to approach this. The right way to approach this really is to lift barriers for fairly traded green products. We can get at this sensibly by pursuing environmental goods agreements at the WTO. I mean, there are ways to facilitate moving into industries or moving into endeavors that will help to deal with the climate. But we need to do so, once again, through trade negotiations that enable us to work on these kinds of policies and get the global community focused on the right kinds of goods and the right kinds of movement that we believe is appropriate for climate policy.
Steve, if you may, we have a question that came in through our Zoom feed.
Oh, cool.
That I was going to read, and it reads, can you comment on the committee's agenda and what you believe the U.S. agenda should be with respect to digital trade issues?
Okay. Well, I've referenced digital trade several times here. Digital trade is critical. It's nearly 8 million jobs right now in the U.S., and if we had fair treatment overseas, it could generate much more. But we need to write the rules so that we get real agreements, or China will write these rules in the negotiations that it's engaging in. And so the first thing we need to do, once again, is to get engaged in negotiating so that we get agreement on the digital trade rules. What should these be? I believe that we could focus on the USMCA, which had a chapter dealing with this, and use that as a starting point. No customs duties on digital goods, no data localization, and no turning over source code and algorithms to other governments. On the enforcement side, we need to confront partners who continue to discriminate against our companies, whether through digital services taxes or through regulations that only apply to American companies. So again, we're on the we're on both the tax and the trade side here. Our digital trade in America, our innovation in America needs to be protected. Once again, through agreements and enforcement. And if we will do that, we've already set a sort of a pattern in the USMCA as to how to approach it. And frankly, as I indicated in response to one of the other questions here, a pattern on how not to approach it. We need to approach it in the smart way to protect our industries and then have the ability to enforce that protection of our industries in both the tax arena and in the trade arena.
So I promised the senator, I promised Ken that I would keep everybody on track and that we'd get you back up to the hill to do the people's business. Let me thank you for your comments here, for participating. As a representative of the apparel industry, let me thank you for your wonderful socks as well. Always think that that's important. And,
that's nuclear energy right there.
Very powerful. But appreciate it very much, and thank you so much, and Godspeed. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning and welcome back to our second panel of the day. Will be, for those of you who are online, thank you for sticking with us through this first of our breaks. We'll have another short break before our 11 a.m. panel as well. To introduce our next guest, I'd like to welcome to the stage my good friend, one of the sponsors of today's conference, Arrow Auduro, Director of America's Public Policy at Amazon, to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Ken, for the introduction and for hosting this year's conference. We're all so lucky to have a leader like WITA who can bring us all together for such great programming. Today, I have the honor of introducing the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Marissa Lago. As you all already know, Undersecretary Lago has had a distinguished career in both public service and in the private sector. In the Obama administration, she served for 7 years at the Department of Treasury as the Assistant Secretary for International Markets and Development, where, among other achievements, she was instrumental in working with the World Bank and other regional counterparts to increase access to capital for women. She also held top roles in city planning and development in both Boston and New York. Prior to her time at Treasury, she led international affairs at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and was the global head of compliance at Citi. In her current role, Undersecretary Lago leads the International Trade Administration, where she is responsible for assisting and promoting American businesses in international markets, enforcing fair trade practices, promoting travel and tourism, and engaging in commercial diplomacy around the world. This work includes playing a key role in Commerce's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework pillars on supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. At Amazon, we are thrilled to have Undersecretary Lago and the entire International Trade Administration team focused on supporting American exporters, especially small and medium-sized businesses. In fact, just over a week ago, Commerce and Amazon launched the Go Global initiative, a new program that will help thousands of small businesses across the U.S. expand their businesses globally. Through the partnership, ITA and Amazon will provide training and resources to help U.S. businesses harness the power of the internet to reach more customers around the globe. We look forward to building on this work with ITA and couldn't be more delighted to have Undersecretary Lago as a partner. And with that, I'll welcome Undersecretary Lago to the stage.
Thanks so much. Well, good morning, and thank you to WITA for the invitation to be here with you today. The more than 2,300 members of the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, or ITA, work every day on building a more prosperous, inclusive, and secure economy. We're strengthening communities and enhancing our economic resilience by bolstering the competitiveness of U.S. industry and workers. We do this by promoting exports, facilitating investment, and ensuring fair trade practices. Equity lies at the core of our efforts, serving all businesses, regardless of size, and expanding opportunity to ensure that the benefits of trade reach more broadly across our communities. Our work is grounded in the conviction that economic security is a key element of our national security. Between the economic fallout of COVID-19, Russia's unjustifiable war against Ukraine, and strategic competition with the People's Republic of China, the imperative to bolster economic security has only grown. Our economic security depends upon our nation's competitiveness on the global stage, which begins with safeguarding our strength and our resilience at home. The Biden-Harris administration has made historic investments in our nation's competitiveness, over $1 trillion through landmark new legislation. These investments are equipping our nation, our businesses, and our workers to compete and win in the 21st century global economy. ITA supports U.S. companies doing business in foreign markets that are home to over 95% of the world's consumers. The data are clear. Businesses that export generally earn higher revenues, create more jobs, and pay better wages. But the power of trade extends beyond export flows, from encouraging the development of high-quality, industry-informed technical standards, to advocating for fair wages globally, to setting the rules of the road for next-generation technologies. Trade is a lever to advance our national interests, and this administration takes an expansive view of the power and the promise that trade offers. While the current environment might not be conducive to signing traditional trade agreements, make no mistake, we are making breakthroughs in creating commercial opportunities on behalf of U.S. businesses and workers, and all the while strengthening our role in the world. We're deepening trade ties with like-minded nations to ensure resilience, counter coercive influences, and protect our national security. We're launching new commercial and investment frameworks in fast-growing regions. We're eliminating barriers and fostering cooperation in essential commercial areas, from digital trade to technical standards. We're embracing leadership of international institutions, including putting forward ITA's own Ian Saunders as the U.S. candidate for Secretary General of the World Customs Organization, something that we have not done since the 90s. We're promoting investment into the United States so that more cutting-edge products continue to be made in America. And since not all countries play by the rules, we're ensuring that what is made elsewhere on the globe is traded fairly in the U.S. So let me get a bit more specific. I'll start by giving you an overview of our activities across the globe. I'll then describe some sectors of the economy that are of particular focus, and I'll end by providing some insights into how we implement our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So here's the tour of the globe. In the Western Hemisphere, we're leaning into long-standing engagements, having restarted the high-level economic dialogue with Brazil and having hosted the 20th U.S.-Brazil commercial dialogue. Through these and other partnerships, we're improving the business environment in our own hemisphere, removing barriers to commerce and creating new opportunities for American businesses to build resilience. In Europe, we're deepening our solidarity in response to Russia's war of aggression, helping allies meet near-term energy needs and plan for long-term energy security, as well as already preparing to support Ukraine's reconstruction. We're also tackling next-generation challenges through the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which works to align our transatlantic approaches to export controls, secure supply chains, data governance, and investment screening. In Africa, we're growing economic engagement grounded in mutual respect and shared interest. Less than 2 days ago, I returned from Tanzania and Zambia, where I saw firsthand the tremendous promise that African markets hold for U.S. businesses. Capitalizing on the momentum from this past December's U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit and Business Forum, my foreign government counterparts and I worked on converting promising dialogues into practical, robust commercial relationships. So I'm going to end my tour by noting that we're working to ensure a free, open, interconnected, Indo-Pacific and prepare for next-generation challenges. With 60% of the world's population, this region is projected to be the largest contributor to global growth over the next 30 years, which is why it's crucial that we deepen our partnerships there. This includes building consensus around shared priorities during 2023, when the United States is hosting Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. It also includes fruitful bilateral engagements, from the U.S.-Singapore Partnership for Growth and Innovation to the U.S.-Japan Economic Policy Consultative Committee. And of course, we're breaking new ground with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. That's a mouthful, so we'll call it IPEF. Let me talk a little bit more about IPEF, as it is a cornerstone of the administration's efforts to reassert U.S. economic leadership and engagement in this dynamic region. We have joined with 13 other partner countries with the shared goal of increasing shared prosperity, shaping technological innovation, and tackling economic challenges while boosting trade and investment. This engagement will yield benefits for partner nations, but also for U.S. businesses, workers, and families. And we're determined that these benefits be broadly and equitably shared. The Department of Commerce is leading 3 IPEF work streams. First, we're working to build supply chain resilience, to mitigate disruptions and foster collective action in critical sectors, while supporting workforce development and labor rights. Second, we're capitalizing on the clean energy transition by helping to unlock the IPEF region's abundant clean energy potential and promoting low and zero emission goods and services. And third, we're leveling the playing field for businesses and workers among IPEF nations by combating corruption, strengthening tax administration, and enhancing transparency. IPEF promotes an affirmative, open vision for economic engagement, but it is impossible to discuss the future of the IPEF region without addressing the challenges posed by the People's Republic of China and ITA's role in addressing them. In a half-century of relations, the U.S.-China relationship is becoming the world's most consequential. China is now our 3rd largest export market, directly supporting 750,000 American jobs. In turn, our private sector has helped shape China's development. Despite hopes that China would embrace political and economic reform and opening, President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party have taken the country down a different path, increasing the role of state in society and the economy, constraining the free flow of capital and information, fusing economic and technology policy with military ambitions, and deploying coercive economic policies against both countries and non-Chinese companies. Secretary Raimondo and leadership across this administration are clear-eyed about the challenges that China's strategy poses for U.S. interests and have adopted a multifaceted approach: invest, align, compete. This strategy will help ensure that the United States continues to lead the global economy in the 21st century, fostering sustainable, equitable, inclusive growth while advancing our values: openness, transparency, rule of law. We're bolstering domestic competitiveness through transformational legislation. We're modernizing our approach to supply chain resiliency, export controls, and both inbound and outbound investment. We're aligning with allies to advance a shared vision for the future. And we're competing with China, leaning into our dynamism to promote our values and to lead the global economy. ITA is advancing the administration's efforts through a balance of protecting and promoting U.S. interests. At the core of ITA's mission is strengthening the competitiveness of U.S. business and workers. Our team counsels companies, works to tackle China's numerous trade barriers, and shares knowledge to support U.S. companies that are doing business in China. In light of China's turn away from reform, however, An increasing part of our work is helping U.S. companies to build resilience against geopolitical shocks, against economic coercion, and against the buildup of heavily subsidized Chinese indigenous industries. Simultaneously, ITA is drawing on a wide array of economic tools to protect the broader U.S. economy. To stand up to anti-competitive behavior, we are enforcing a record number of anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. And we're counseling U.S. businesses that are suffering from unfair trade practices. To protect the competitiveness of critical U.S. industries, we are helping implement a stronger inbound investment review regime. Simultaneously, we're identifying the best approaches to prevent outbound U.S. investment flows from supporting foreign initiatives that would undermine our security. Investment review is particularly salient in strategic technology industries, where we're working diligently to protect our unmatched innovation ecosystem, harnessing strong relationships with industry and other stakeholders to pursue effective action that minimizes unintended consequences. Still, while we must always be vigilant to protect our U.S. economic and national security, China remains an important export market. Let me be clear, we do not seek to decouple from the Chinese economy. As President Biden has emphasized, we'll seek to work together to address global challenges and maintain a commercial relationship that's in line with U.S. values and objectives. Our ITA commercial services team is on the ground in China, working to promote trade and investment in target sectors like consumer goods, environmental products, pollution control, and healthcare. But make no mistake, our promoting of U.S. commercial interests will not distract from our #1 priority, protecting and advancing our economic and national security interests. We'll mitigate downside risk and insist on high standards and human rights, from supporting enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act to helping businesses protect their intellectual property. These same principles guide our engagement with other emerging markets. We are not asking countries to choose between the United States and the PRC. Rather, we present ourselves as a compelling alternative for principled partnership. So now let me turn to sectors that are front of mind for ITA. First, supply chains. Once this was a topic for policy wonks and logistics experts, but since the pandemic, supply chain issues have become both dinner table and boardroom conversations as both families and businesses grappled with bottlenecks, vulnerabilities, and shortages. Knowing that robust, resilient supply chains are central to our security and prosperity, the administration continues to take decisive action to alleviate issues in critical sectors, from medical devices to automobiles. Did you know that it is ITA's analysis and industry engagement that underpins efforts to resolve shortages and delays? Our team provides U.S. producers with information to understand their vulnerabilities and obtain the inputs that they need to compete. We are building capabilities to proactively identify and reduce over-reliance, most especially on supply chains running through countries that don't share our democratic ideals. We aim to anticipate and mitigate future challenges to help ensure that the United States maintains secure and reliable access to the materials that are necessary to meet our needs, protect our security, and to lead the industries of the future. Not surprisingly, we have put supply chains at the center of our international engagements. We're also placing a special emphasis on promoting the export of cutting-edge clean energy and climate resilience technologies. Since day one, the administration has been committed to combating climate change, both at home and abroad. Russia's illegal war against Ukraine heightens the imperative to accelerate the green transition, ensuring energy security and diversity of supply. This is especially salient in Europe, where we've supported our allies in obtaining new energy sources and infrastructure. To help address these twin crises, ITA is helping U.S. businesses bring to global markets technologies to speed the transition to net zero emissions. A couple of statistics. In 2022 alone, we facilitated over $3 billion in clean tech exports. At the same time, we work with foreign entities that are interested in investing in U.S. facilities. Last year, we facilitated some $27 billion in clean tech investment into the United States, and this includes an electric vehicle battery plant that will create thousands of jobs in Ohio. The importance of this work extends well beyond its dollar value. By leaning into our strength in innovation, we're enabling other countries to both pursue their Paris commitments, but also achieve energy independence. Good as we are, we know that the United States alone can't solve the climate crisis. International cooperation is crucial. And that's why we've made climate a focus of our global engagement. This includes working through our small modular reactor public-private program to advance the commercial deployment of next-generation U.S. civil nuclear technology, which will help accelerate the transition from coal-fired plants. So, not surprisingly, another topic that's on the agenda for many of our bilateral and multilateral engagements is the digital economy, and most especially ensuring robust cross-border data flows that are consistent with both privacy and security needs. We're pursuing this work by implementing the US-EU data privacy framework and by advancing a global cross-border privacy rule system for interoperable data regimes. We're also doing our part to protect partner nations from coercive influence, whether by encouraging the use of secure equipment in key telecommunications projects, boosting cybersecurity cooperation, or harnessing the potential of next-generation technologies. So the final topic I want to raise is one that lies at the heart of the Biden-Harris administration: equity. Ensuring that growth at home is equitable demands not only increasing exports, but also increasing the pool of exports. Who is exporting? Equity is at the core of everything that we do at ITA, which is why we're committed to supporting rural, minority, veteran, and women-owned businesses. Equally, we're committed to serving micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, which comprise the vast majority of U.S. exporters. MSMEs are 85% of the clients that ITA serves. MSMEs and diverse businesses have unique advantages and huge potential for growth, but these same businesses often face obstacles: lack of opportunity, inaccurate perception of risk, insufficient financing, and challenges in identifying and vetting potential partners. In over 100 cities and towns across the U.S., ITA has trade specialists who help businesses overcome these obstacles so that they can grow in global markets. Now, this entails revisiting our tools. They were developed for larger players, and we're retooling them to make sure that they meet the needs of MSMEs. We have prioritized programming, support, and outreach to minority and women-owned businesses. We've brought diverse U.S. businesses to the world. Last year, ITA led its first ever minority-focused trade mission, and we followed that with another first, a Women in Tech trade mission that I had the pleasure of leading. We're meeting MSMEs in their own communities as part of our Global Diversity Export Initiative, GDEI. Now, GDEI leverages leading national chambers of commerce and diverse business associations to ensure that our trade shows, missions, and counseling services reach businesses in historically underserved communities. This includes working through our Building Bridges to Global Markets program, which has brought no-cost in-person expertise and resources to hundreds of businesses in communities from Jackson, Mississippi to Cleveland, Ohio. These initiatives are just the start. This year, we are doubling down, implementing a women's economic empowerment and entrepreneurship strategy, leading dedicated minority-focused trade missions to Brazil and a number of countries in Africa, promoting tourist destinations in underserved communities as part of our national travel and tourism strategy, tapping the potential of diaspora communities in building export relationships, and putting a spotlight on MSMEs as part of our APEC host year. So in conclusion, in my first year in this role, I've been in 18 countries and several states in the US. Now, while abroad, I have encountered a consistent hunger for US engagement and solutions. And here at home, I see a desire to strengthen businesses and communities through growth in global markets. At ITA, we're making major strides to address these mutually reinforcing demands, and our approach is well calibrated to a dynamic, interconnected global economic landscape. I'm proud to be serving in an administration that is deploying a wide range of commercial and trade tools to advance our economic and national security, enhance the competitiveness of US businesses and workers, and promote equitable and sustainable growth in an open global system. Thank you all.
I'd like to welcome to the stage to join Undersecretary Lago, our good friend Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and a good friend of WITA and a frequent partner with us on many of our webinars and in-person events. Thank you so much for joining us today, Wendy.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Undersecretary Lago. You certainly covered a lot of territory, both geographic and substantive. So just allow me to drill down on a few issues. First, right before you spoke, Senator Crapo joined us, and I think it's fair to say he was kind of critical of US trade policy, and specifically the reluctance of the administration to negotiate market opening, I think he said market opening, comprehensive, congressionally approved trade agreements. He also said, and I quote, "If the administration takes a timeout on trade, Congress will step in." Would you like to respond?
Gladly. And I should also note for the audience that Wendy and I are buddies who go way back. We worked together closely when Wendy was at USTR and I was at the Department of Treasury, so I'm thrilled that we're up here in this conversation. Senator Crapo's views are long held and well known. Senator Crapo, in fact, posed similar questions to me during my nominations hearing. What I find interesting about the state of trade in the US mindset today is that even within Senator Crapo's own party, there are senators who have diametrically opposed views, and the same holds true on the other side of the aisle. There is widespread disagreement about the role of trade and the nature of trade agreements within the United States. So against this backdrop, are we doing nothing? No, that's not an option. We are looking at what are the pressing issues of the day. Clearly, the digital economy is already here and is only going to grow. That is an area where issues of tariff reduction just aren't salient. So we are doubling down on our commercial engagement with partners around the world. And as I mentioned in my remarks, we are coming up against a very welcome interest in commercial engagement with the US and with our industries. We know that we have an innovation economy that is the envy of the rest of the world. So far from stepping back from trade, we are engaging in commercial dialogues that are addressing the issues that confront people today, whether supply chains, clean technology, digital trade.
Maybe we can move to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. I understand Commerce just completed 4 days of a very successful round in India. Coming out of that meeting, both the Indian trade minister as well as the Japanese representative have been in the press talking about the importance of early harvest. And I believe that someone even mentioned maybe early harvest by the trade ministers meeting in May in the United States. Is that possible?
Well, let me give you a couple of insights into what just went on in Delhi. And I'll note that this meeting in Delhi came hard on the heels of a negotiating session in Brisbane in mid-December. We had over 300 delegates from the IPEF member nations. We also, as part of this negotiating round, held an in-person stakeholder listening session that included both Indian and U.S. businesses. We found the meetings to be positive, constructive, and turning to the U.S. delegation, it's not just on the 3 pillars that commerce leads. It's not just commerce representatives. We have subject matter experts from across the full range of U.S. Government agencies, State Department, Treasury, EPA, DOE, on and on. We, in structuring IPEF, realized that there could be the potential for different timing for each of the pillars. We did not package it up and say none of the 4 will be resolved until all 4 are resolved, because we recognize that some could be easier than others.
A single undertaking approach.
Exactly, not adopting that. So all 14 members are committed, I could say fast-paced, but it's actually a blistering pace that we're undertaking. Secretary Raimondo has been very public about her interest in seeing progress on the pillars that her agency leads this year. I would say as proactive as she is in public, she's even more so in private. This is clearly a priority for her. We're still in the early phases of negotiations. We have yet another round planned in the coming month. And so I'm not going to speculate about which pillar might proceed on what time frame, but I have been heartened by the fact that this isn't a U.S. push alone. It's not just a developed large economy push alone. Across the IPEF member nations, there is a sense of the significance of the undertaking and a desire to get each pillar done fast, and again, not to hold up, not to take a single undertaking approach.
So the conclusion is it's possible?
You've heard me.
Any indications that India might join the trade pillar?
I would pose that to the Indian representatives.
Okay.
The reason for that question is that of the 14 IPEF member nations, 13 have chosen to join all 4 pillars, something that was not at all a foregone conclusion when we launched IPEF. Actually, having 14 members wasn't a foregone conclusion when we launched, and it is only India that has chosen not to join IPEF Pillar 1, the trade pillar.
And just finally, before we leave IPEF, we all noted that USTR, at least at senior levels, this wasn't a joint negotiating round, it was a commerce-led round on their pillars. Is this kind of a one-off type of meeting, or are we likely to see commerce going its own way and USTR going its own way?
I have to take issue with your characterization of Congress going its own way and USTR its own way. We work so collaboratively with USTR. I know that people would love to see a plot or some malign interagency fighting going on. That's not the case. We saw the opportunity to make significant progress on the text that we had tabled, And so we seized the opportunity, coupled with India's interest in the 3 pillars that it's joined, to host the meeting. And so we seized that opportunity. Because this is not a traditional trade agreement, to use a phrase that a few of us might be old enough to know, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. This is a new approach to today's trade issues. We will be flexible in what meetings make sense among which groupings.
Okay. So before we leave that region of the world, APEC, we're hosting APEC, big year. Commerce plays a role in many different aspects of APEC, including leading the SME ministerial. We'll be holding one this year. I think last year...
August in Seattle.
Last year, you led the Commerce delegation. Given the importance of SMEs to the administration, I think you talked at the end about the importance of really broadening the net of folks who participate in trade. Do you think Secretary Raimondo will lead the delegation this year?
I think it's probably too early to know who will lead the delegation, other than to assure that it will be a senior level official. If I could elaborate a little bit on our APEC host year, the overall theme is inclusivity, affirming an equitable and inclusive future for all. And that is going to suffuse all of the countless APEC work streams. As you mentioned, I had the pleasure of leading the U.S. delegation on the SME work stream. That's the only work stream on which Commerce is lead. And we are going to build on Thailand's goals. Thailand was the host last year. And they called it the biocircular green economy, particularly focusing on green transformation for SMEs. We anticipate that we are going to use digital tools, including digital trade, to help SMEs innovate and to compete globally. Now, the Department of Commerce also led an APEC project on promoting women's entrepreneurship through e-commerce for the past couple of years. And we're going to expand on this during our host year. And I can give you a sneak preview. We are going to be holding a joint session of the SME ministers, but also the high-level policy dialogue on women in the economy. We think that there is just such a
And they're both meeting in Seattle in August.
Exactly. We just see such synergies there. Another focus that we have as part of our leadership of the SME track is a forum on APEC business ethics for SMEs. And we are going to be holding a session of that forum in Washington, D.C., not Seattle. And we focus on high standard code of ethics, on SME capacity building, and then strengthening the collective action around ethical business practices. So it's going to be a ton of work, but we are very much looking forward to hosting APEC this year.
It's a great opportunity. And I know right now, I think our delegations are in Palm Springs, the first official senior officials meeting this year. Let's turn to China quickly, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. Listen carefully on Commerce's role. I think you use the terms protect, but also promote. One thing maybe you could elaborate on, since there are a bunch of business folks out here, in terms of market access barriers that U.S. companies are facing in China, are we still working on those? If business comes to USTR with problems, to Commerce, sorry. If business comes to Commerce with market access problems or comes to the administration, is the administration still working those issues?
Of course, as evidenced by the fact that we have foreign commercial service teams on the ground. Yes, we promote exports, but once U.S. companies have exported, if they are running into barriers, we engage in commercial advocacy. That is at the core of what we do, and that's across the board, including in China.
And is China picking up our phone when we raise these barriers?
We are very actively engaged, Wendy, as you know.
Okay. All right, open up to the floor. Ken, you could help me here. I don't see anyone.
Thank you, Ken.
Robert Tobiasen, formerly with Treasury, now head of the National Association of Beverage Importers, as in alcohol. It's 34 years with Treasury. It seems to me in any program area there's a dichotomy of policy and operations. You know, the policy is the big macro, the operational side is the micro. Listening to your comments, Madam Undersecretary, it seems that the ITA is what I would call the operational side. You're in the trenches, you're in the front, you're the first interface with small and medium-sized enterprises. USTR is more what I call the policy side, looking at the big picture, the macro. In that bifurcation, how do you see the role of ITA in informing the policymakers on how to develop the direction of the macro policy based on your interaction in the more granular operations? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. It is spoken like a true Treasury veteran, focusing on the macro and the micro. And again, your question also evidences your long tenure in government in understanding that USTR is charged with developing trade policy. But I think that the bifurcation that you talk about overstates things. We work with USTR not just every day, but multiple times a day. Wendy will know this from her time at USTR.
And USTR picks up the phone.
Often they're the ones who initiate the phone calls. It goes both ways. Policy and implementation are not worlds apart. There is a very significant overlap. How do you develop good policy? It has to be informed by the experience of industry on the ground. We're proud at ITA that we engage with industry every single day. We learn from them, we hear what their issues are, and that directly feeds into our conversations with USTR and the resultant policy. And so I think it's a Venn diagram with very significant overlap. Great question.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. I wanted to ask about the somewhat unusual action last year where the president put a pause on the duties for circumvention of AD/CVD with solar panels. And my question is, has that accomplished what was hoped? I think the idea was that projects were stalling and imports were stopping because people were concerned about how much duties they would have to pay as that case proceeded. So I want to know if imports kind of picked back up after the duty pause.
There was another question back there, too. Can we take that one as well? I thought I saw someone else back there.
One on this side.
You get your exercise.
Thank you, Jana Dreyer from Borderlegs, a trade policy publication based in Europe, but independent of EU institutions. I was very struck by your statement that national security is the overarching policy goal here, and that digital is basically number two. I have a question. So what does this mean for ongoing negotiations in the WTO on an e-commerce plurilateral agreement? Does that mean would the US be pulling out if this means doing a deal in digital with China? Thank you.
Could take one
I'm
more.
glad to take those two together, in part because the two questions go to other parts of U.S. government. The executive order came from the White House. As you know, a significant part of what ITA, the International Trade Administration, does is make sure that other countries' companies live by the trade rules. And what is emblematic of that is our work on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. But the policy came from the White House, so you may need, WITA may need to invite someone from the NSC. With respect to your question, again, a great question, but all things WTO are the province of USTR.
Okay. Who's got other questions? Let's try and keep it in Commerce's wheelhouse.
Hi, this is Jonathan McHale from the Computer and...
Hi, Jonathan.
Yes, and Communications Association. The AFL-CIO has just put out a statement with respect to digital trade, essentially arguing that rules in the digital space are essentially designed solely for big companies and are adverse in impact on U.S. workers. You have mentioned that you are promoting free flow of data, things like that affect this. How would you respond to their suggestion that rules in this space are not in the U.S. national interest from the perspective of workers? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I haven't seen the statement, so I'm not going to be responding directly to something that I haven't read. But digital trade is a reality. When people talk about the coming digital economy, it's here now. And that is why the administration has placed such significant importance on assuring that we have free flow of information across the Atlantic. That's the new EU-US data protection framework. In all that we do, we look to adopt what Ambassador Tai has called a worker-centric approach to trade. We make sure that underpinning our thinking is an understanding of industry, an understanding of workers, an understanding of the environment, and also an understanding of balancing when it comes to data, the need for data as the lifeblood of commerce, but also the appropriate protection of privacy. It is something that is just in our DNA as we approach our discussions, both domestically and for ITA with our partners around the world.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can...
We have one question I want to read that came in from our Zoom listeners. And they were following up on our panel yesterday on climate and trade, and they were wondering if you could expand a little bit on the role that you see ITA and commerce playing in the global fight against climate change.
And who did the question come from, if I might? Do we know?
This one came in anonymously.
Okay.
I didn't want to have their name read.
So hello, anonymous. But thank you for a question that is such a central part. We know that we are an innovation economy, that we produce technological solutions that can help countries around the world. Now, countries that are interested in our climate-related technologies used to care about it because they wanted to meet the demands for more energy in their nations, while at the same time meeting their Paris commitments. If we go back to February 24th of last year, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a third compelling reason: energy independence. And we have found ever increasing interest in the solutions that U.S. companies can provide. And when I say U.S. companies, of course, it's the large multinationals that are already operating in this space, but it is also small, medium-sized startups that are part of our innovation economy. And when I say our innovation economy, it is the fact that we have research institutions that are the envy of the world. We take for granted protection of intellectual property, which cannot be assumed in way too many countries on the globe. And all of these feed into having companies that are at the cutting edge of every facet of green energy.
I'm going to take the prerogative and ask the last, is this the last question, Ken? Okay. Africa. I hear you're just back from a 40-hour return trip.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever went 40 hours. Maybe Ambassador Schwab can match you there.
It had a little bit to do with a very delayed flight from Frankfurt home.
But I'd just be interested in your impressions there, and particularly given the recent Leaders Summit that the president held with African leaders here. Secretary Yellen was just in Africa, now you, other administration folks. But it's coming at a time, really, where China's really out there, surpassed the United States with respect to trade with Africa, has surpassed the United States with respect to FDI in Africa. Can we still compete in that region? Have we kind of lost out? Are we behind?
We can absolutely compete. There is such a hunger for and a welcoming of the U.S.'s engagement in the region. I think that there is a growing recognition among numerous African leaders that the initial appeal of lower cost financing comes with a cost. The upfront costs are lower. China can move more quickly than we do, but it comes with a higher tolerance for corruption. And we are finding a growing skepticism about the sustainability of this way of operating. And a recognition is evident, this recognition is evident both in the government and in the private sector. Whenever I travel, obviously I meet with my foreign government counterparts, and being the Department of Commerce, it's not just a commerce or a trade ministry. It covers, I routinely meet with a foreign ministry, with an energy ministry. In Zambia, given its economy, with the Ministry of Mines. And I also, though, always meet with the American Chamber of Commerce and very frequently with local chambers of commerce to hear the ground truth from the businesses that are there. And I meet with members of civil society, so the entire range. As an aside, I'll also note that I hold a diversity-related event in every country that I meet with as evidence of our commitment in working to enhance. In many countries, the only element of diversity that is on the public mind is gender, but in other countries, it extends far beyond just gender. We believe, we see that countries, including in Africa, recognize the benefit of U.S. investors. When U.S. companies invest, they pass along know-how. They also overwhelmingly hire locally, and so there is a long-term investment in the country. When we invest, our companies have high-quality standards. And if one looks at, in the context of government procurement, the cost, not just upfront of buying our goods, but the life cycle cost of, say, a power plant, the U.S. becomes far, far more competitive. So I am incredibly heartened by the fact that in both Tanzania and Zambia, there is a recognition at the highest levels of government about the fact that corruption is a cost. I had the privilege in Zambia of spending 40 minutes in a meeting with President Hichilema, and I did not have to proactively raise points about corruption. It was front of mind on his agenda, and that certainly inures to the benefit of U.S. exporters.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Madam Undersecretary, for your time and for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have hosted you for the first time here at WITA. Everyone, we are taking just a very short break. I don't want you to all leave the room. We're just going to reset the stage for our final panel. So if you'll just bear with us, we'll be back on in about less than 10 minutes. Thank you all for sticking with us. Thanks to those of you who are online. Pleasure to have you all back again. And welcome back our Ambassadors Roundtable. It's a tradition here at the Washington International Trade Conference, and we're so pleased to have the panel back again in person this year. Ambassador Mapuri, I think this is your 5th time speaking at WITA, and you were a featured guest at our last in-person trade conference in 2020. We're honored to host you once again. Ambassador Olofsdotter, welcome to WITA. We're delighted to host you here at our home. I was mentioning to you that we actually hosted an event at the House of Sweden when you first came in 2017, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to WITA's home here at the Reagan Building. Ambassador Tsukada, we were honored to host Ambassador Tomita Hoji at our last online conference last year. We're honored to host you in person this year. And of course, it's a distinct pleasure to welcome our discussion leader and our dear friend, Ambassador Susan Schwab, the former United States Trade Representative. Susan also serves as the chair of the board of the National Foreign Trade Council and the faculty chair of the WITA Academy. As many of you know, the WITA Academy launched late last year with the goal of making trade education and careers in international trade accessible to communities in the United States and around the world, and to make the trade community itself more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. The Academy will be ramping up our programming in 2023, including outreach to universities across the United States and global trade education efforts. With that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Susan, for our final panel of the day.
Ken, thank you very, very much. And it's always a delight to participate in a WITA program, particularly this WITA program. You put on scads of terrific programming all year long, but this is a particular favorite of mine, and this panel, the ambassadors panel, is a particular favorite. And we have a wonderful group of ambassadors with us today. I'm not going to get into gory detail about their wonderful credentials. You can read that in your program, but I am going to target my questions based on some of these credentials, because as you will find, each one of our ambassadors brings to the table a unique perspective and set of credentials that inform their perspectives on some of the questions I plan to ask. And I'm going to start my questioning, and I'm asking questions in the order in which they took up their posts here in Washington, if you are wondering why I'm doing this order. I'm going to start with Ambassador Mirpuri from Singapore, a great friend of mine and a great friend of WITA's, as Ken mentioned. And I'm going to start with the observation that the Singapore-U.S. Free Trade Agreement is one of our longer-standing free trade agreements. It was concluded or launched really in 2004. It is one of free trade agreements we have with 20 countries. And that is in contrast to Singapore's 50-plus bilateral free trade agreements. How many?
More than 50.
More than 50.
And growing.
And growing. Which is the basis on which I'm going to start my questions, because perhaps Ambassador Mirpuri, you could start with some observations about the bilateral Singapore-U.S. trade relations, and then the perception of U.S. and U.S. trade policy from Singapore, maybe in the light of the fact that we're kind of stuck at 20 free trade agreements, and Singapore is just keeping going. You walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So, Ambassador Mirpuri.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to WITA and Ken for inviting me back. I get the first question because I've been here very long. I haven't been here as long as the FTA has been in existence, but long enough to have seen the ebbs and flows of U.S. trade policy. And that has really been the challenge. You ask about the Singapore-U.S. trade relationship. Singapore started doing FTAs in the late 1990s because the WTO framework had stalled for a while. Still remains stalled, and I hope we get into a conversation on WTO because the multilateral global trade agenda still remains very important for small countries. It still remains important while bigger countries speak of economic security. We're still very focused on that. But we started doing bilateral free trade agreements, and the US was obviously the big prize, given the strong economy over here, the investment opportunities over here, the trade connectivity. It was a complicated FTA to sign, despite the asymmetry in the economies. a large global economic superpower, a small country on the other side of the world trying to sign an agreement. But in many ways, it helped lead the way for the US to get a little bit more involved in some of those 20 plus FTAs. It was the first FTA the US did with a nation country. And from Singapore's point of view, yes, we had a lot of benefit from that FTA. We raised our standards of intellectual property protection. We got into the issues around making sure rule of law worked. We have now become the hub for US investments in the region. There are over $300 billion worth of US investments in the region, not just for Singapore, but because it's become that ability for US companies to use Singapore to reach out to Asia. And that's been very critical for US companies as they look around and say, where can we do more? Singapore is a very significant investor in the United States, creating jobs in the US as well. But really, this bilateral FTA that we had was more than just back. If we look back in the early 2000s as we did that, the plan was to get the US a little bit more, into the network of trade arrangements across the Pacific. The TPP emerged out of the US-Singapore FTA. Singapore started doing something called the P4 with Brunei and Chile and New Zealand, and the US then got into the TPP. The intention was never to stop at a bilateral arrangement, but really to build up a big network of arrangements, and that's been the key for us. Today, as we look at the world 20 years later, geopolitics has changed, geoeconomics have changed. We still think there's an opportunity for the US to do more with countries like Singapore to lead the way on some of the new areas that we are talking about, what the Undersecretary spoke about, the digital trade, the sustainability economy. I think that if we look at these different size economies, Singapore and the US, but really front runners in many of these areas, getting that leadership role, that's been the critical part of how we see our engagement with the US. Thank you.
That is very, very helpful. And just building on that, how would you say Singapore and perhaps others in the region perceive U.S. trade policy today?
Well, the Undersecretary said there is not very much of a trade policy, if you read between what she said. It's economic security. We now have something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is not a free trade agreement. There are good reasons for what the US is doing in terms of focusing on investments at home. Every country focuses on investments at home. Every country focuses on economic security. I think the challenge from the region working with the US on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, is the lack of market access. And when you don't have market access, there's no real trade policy. What are we speaking about if we do not have market access? I mean, we were frank with the administration and we're open with them that there has to be some conversation around market access in order to make IPEF or any other arrangement more attractive to the countries of the region. We see all the other elements of it. But Washington, again, there's a certain amount of schizophrenia around trade because Senator Crapo spoke about trade very positively. I go to Capitol Hill and people are speaking to me about trade. Now, is this because a way of sort of making a difference with the administration? The US has always been the economic leader in the region. And I think the countries of the region want to see the US continue to play that role. In playing that role, we want to see more trade arrangements, more market access, not things that are unfair to each other, but ones that really build a world in which we can connect through many of these new areas. So if you coming back to the main point of the question, the countries of the region are somewhat disappointed that we're not getting the kind of trade agenda that we would have liked from the US.
And I want to come back to your question about the WTO and to Senator Crapo's comments this morning, because I think he did open the door to a more proactive, potentially far more proactive U.S. trade policy and support for the Congress. Ambassador Olofsdotter, thank you very much for being here. And looking at your bio, it was hard for me to figure out what questions to ask because your background in terms of the EU, in terms of trade, in Sweden, in terms of starting out your career in Russia, You have a wealth of knowledge that is so relevant today. I'm going to start out sort of with the obvious, and then we'll move into less obvious territory. The obvious, obviously, is your comments, your thoughts on Swedish-U.S. and EU-U.S. trade at the present moment. Be very much interested in your take on that.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you so much to WITA for having me. It's great to be here on stage with these important partner countries of Sweden and, of course, the United States. So I would say that the bilateral relationship between Sweden and the U.S. is really good. Sweden is 10 million people. We are the 13th largest investor in the United States, and 10 million people brings us to like number 90 when it comes to population. So you realize the size of our economy and our business community. We are home to a lot of household names, Ericsson, H&M. Most people think H&M is German, but it's not. Securitas, the security company, actually employs 100,000 people, just that. So we employ, with our investments here, around 370,000 people in America. So that's a lot. And we heard before the Undersecretary talking about the relationship with China, which was like 700,000 jobs. So we are a force to reckon with. So you realize that the American market for us is paramount for our economy. We are roughly around 50% of our GDP is based on trade with others. So we are one of the true free trade champions of Europe. Swedish trade unions are pro-free trade because most of them go to work in industries that are dependent on trade. So for us, global value chains, keeping the economies open, free trade agreements, that's part of our DNA. So we have, of course, the last years seen a little bit more of a struggle about that, both within the European Union, but also in our relationship to the United States. So this is really, really important. And also, not just with trade. And I think what has shifted during my time here, I've been here 6 years, is I think that we see trade now as, in a way, part of our security fabric as well. Because we see the relationship between the United States and China. We see the relationship also with China and Europe and US. I mean, all goes together because our three big economies are so tied together. So we often get the challenge or the questions like, will we decouple trade with China? Of course we will not, just like the Undersecretary said. But you also have to realize if you are a big multinational company investing in the United States, you become part of the US security fabric when it comes then to dual-use investments in China and other parts of the world. So that's really important to keep in mind, I think, in this whole trade relationship. Just then briefly on, Sweden holds the presidency of the European Union right now. It is an extremely challenging time. We all know that there's a really ugly war going on in Europe with Russia having attacked a sovereign democratic state in Europe. This, of course, puts everything what we do in that kind of limelight and framework. So the priorities for our presidency is a more secure Europe, a greener Europe, and a more democratic Europe. So security and greener in this way almost goes hand in hand, because when it comes to security, it's of course doing everything we possibly can to help the Ukrainians in this war. It's about already thinking about rebuilding and all that. But also when it comes to greener, is how do we wean ourselves off energy dependence from Russia, for instance. And we also heard the Undersecretary talking earlier about the huge exports of energy from the United States to Europe, which is extremely important in these times. But it also gives us a chance to transform our economies, to come up with, speed up the green revolution, so to speak, that had already started. So you can connect security and trade and investment and technology development in this sense. But I think also that the situation we are in globally really, puts geosecurity and geoeconomy together, and we must find resilient, good supply chains. We always talk about supply chains, but I think this will just grow more and more important. And we see the United States policies with kind of regional areas of supply chains, etc. So I really think that if we are serious about, our democracies, our way of life that we have in the United States and Europe, we must work even closer together. We are doing that, but I think we can cooperate more. And of course, I can talk hours about the IRA, which is both good and bad. But we really must get to a very good place where we have, as open trade as we possibly can across the Atlantic. Because if we set the rules of future of technology or trade, that will just strengthen us. So it's important.
So you put a whole lot of really interesting issues on the table. Let me follow up on one or connect a couple of points that you made. I think we would all agree that at this point in time, on the national security side, we're seeing more transatlantic cooperation than we've seen in obviously many, many years. In my experience on the trade side, one of the challenges that we have has been that the EU gets together in Brussels and everybody beats each other's brains out coming up with a mandate or a policy. And by the time that policy is developed, there's really no room to negotiate anything with anybody else. And the perception from the outside, including from the US, is often those policies are quite protectionist. What could we, and this is in contrast to what we're seeing now on the national security side. And I think your point about how increasingly the national security side and the trade side and economic and national security are intertwined irrevocably, this is not just a near-term thing, brings to mind the question, what could we be doing to improve the bilateral relationship going forward on the economic side so that we don't see that kind of inward-looking economic policy development, and we don't find ourselves sort of on our back feet when we finally sit down?
Well, that's a really good question, and what you're saying is, of course, correct, that the negotiations we have in Europe are very tough and very many views. Some countries in Europe are more protectionist and have that kind of streak. Others are not, and we are one of the ones who do not have that kind of agenda. So it's an uphill battle for us sometimes as well within the European Union. But just like in Washington, you have to get to an agreement. And I hope we can have agreements that are more flexible when we go out to our partners. We are just about to close now a few other new trade agreements, so we are able to negotiate as well, even though it takes time. But I really think that when we look at cross-Atlantic trade and affairs, this sounds very superficial in a way, but we are each other's most important partners. We are the biggest markets in the world. And if we are serious about cooperating, for instance, on standards of future technology, that will be the world standards. And then other bigger players will have to follow because we are the markets. So I think that we cannot afford to have a relationship. For instance, there's worry in my country with the IRA, for instance, with fantastic subsidies here. And it's fantastic that the United States is really taking on climate technology and change and all that. And I hear from Swedish companies that, yes, we will pull our investments from Europe, put them in the US because the subsidies are great. What I worry about is that we will see a race to the bottom on subsidies now, which will not benefit any one of us. But then again, how do we do this? As Ambassador here said, we all want investments in our countries. That's correct. But I think here we have to be very careful so we don't shoot ourselves in the foot when we look at the more global and geopolitical picture of what we want to achieve. Because we are really each other's best friends. And it sounds superficial, but it is true as well.
Thank you. And I will note for the record, I'm a moderator here. So, Ambassador Tsukada, again, you bring a wealth of background, particularly in terms of your engagement in multilateral and plurilateral fora, G7, G20, TPP, climate, and so on. So I'm going to steer my questioning for you about Japan's role and engagement. And my relationship in terms of Japan, US-Japan trade negotiations goes back further than I'm going to admit to anyone in this room. But suffice it to say, Japan's approach to trade policy and international economic policy, I would argue, has changed very dramatically in the last decade. Japan used to be quiet, maybe hostilely quiet, but quiet. And we have seen in the last 10 years or so, Japan really step forward and assert a leadership role, really take a leadership role, not just on behalf of obvious Japanese economic interests, but also sort of broader regional interests and broader national security and geopolitical interests. And Japan's approach used to be predictable. It's less predictable now, and it's really been fascinating for those of us who've been engaged with Asia for many, many years to watch. So in that context, I'd be interested in your view of Japan-US relations and how you would like to see that relationship evolve. And then obviously, I'm going to start moving us toward your perception of Japan's view of the US role in Asia on an economic basis as Ambassador Mipuri started to take us.
Thank you, Ambassador Schwab, for that very, very well thought out question. Well, I wasn't sure when you said Japan, you thought Japan was quiet. That was a good thing or a bad thing?
I started out negotiating.
We were more quiet and malleable,
citrus.
maybe?
I started out negotiating beef, citrus, and telecom market access in Japan a very long time ago. So it's a different world.
Indeed. Well, anyway, jokes aside, I would like to first share with you some of my thoughts. Looking back, my career, I sort of perceive myself more of a trade guy. So in the context of international trade, when I joined the ministry in the late 1980s, it was the height of the US-Japan trade war. Well, maybe war is not the right word, trade tensions. On the one hand, it was a question of how we address the question of trade surpluses, trade deficits, this imbalance. But at the same time, it was a question of how we deal with the question of managing trade. And we weren't sure at that time also whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to manage trade. Of course, there was also the question whether it was feasible or even meaningful macroeconomically. But anyway, I thought Japan's role at that time as a young officer was to argue for the reason. And I also remember the infamous Toshiba Kokom incident in the late 80s, where Toshiba was denounced of leaking sensitive technologies to the Soviets. And I think there is a lot of lessons and experience which is very relevant to the modern context, the way we have to manage the conflict between free trade and national security interest. And fast forward in the early 2000s, there was a big debate, theoretically and politically, between the so-called multilateralist camp and the regionalists, or the free FTA promoters, or the FTA-ites. And Japan, of course, was at that time multilateralist in Geneva, but of course, gradually the multilateralists were sidelined, and we moved to the FTA camp. And incidentally, Singapore, of course, was the first partner with whom we had the historical landmark Japan-Singapore FTA, which opened the floodgate of the dozens of FTAs which we entered into thereafter. So in hindsight, that was the watershed year for our sort of transformation into a bilateral regionalist approach in this trade world. And the culmination of that was, of course, our entry into the TPP. And I was privileged to be able to take part in the formative process of the entry negotiation of the TPP in the 2010s and 11s, that period. And I think in hindsight, during that period of our sort of deliberation of whether or not to enter into TPP, that was a period when trade policy, at least in the Japanese context, came to acquire a more foreign policy overtone, if I may. The idea that TPP is an instrument to achieve strategic objective. And that was how TPP was sold domestically, to justify the costs and burdens which was most acutely felt by the ag sector. And this line was particularly vigorously promoted by late Prime Minister Abe. So TPP, to all intents and purposes, is a regional integration instrument, regional economic integration instrument. But in my view, it has transformed into, or it has transcended the sort of economic sort of meaning and transformed into a sort of a method or a structure, something bigger, a cornerstone, if I may, foundation of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. So I take it that it is Japan's role in the modern context of the TPP to promote this TPP instrument as a sort of new foundation to underpin our ideals, the vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and to promote this new vision of the CPTP, the vision that it has acquired or assumed in the wider U.S. Political context. And of course, the latest U.S.-Japan economic relationship is characterized more by the what I would call strategic themes, such as the supply chain resilience, how to strengthen supply chain resilience, how to defend the critical emerging technology, and how to fight back the weaponization of trade, i.e. economic coercion. So these are the sort of transformation of the trade policy in the context of that sort of bilateral development of bilateral relationship that I see for what it's worth through my experience serving in this world. And I think if I were to be asked what is the role of Japan now, I think is to argue for a strong leadership of the United States, to present a strong trade policy, at least to the Indo-Pacific world.
Boy, Tsukada-san, that was terrific. So the academic trade policy wonk in me is all excited about your answers here, and I'm going to go off script here, and I'm going to pull from each of your comments and outline sort of a worldview that you all have laid out, and that is dramatic changes and transformations that we're all dealing with, whether it is evolution from the multilateral to bilateral and regional focus, from subsidies, from sort of focus on free trade to subsidies and managed trade, to the juxtaposition of international economic policy and geopolitics and foreign policy, national security, including trade controls, export controls, and your point about companies investing, foreign, non-US companies investing here becoming part of US geopolitical trade decisions. Obviously, there are other trends we could talk about, but let's take those. And you all live here, and you're reporting back to your capitals about what's going on here, and clearly foremost on the minds of most Americans, most American politicians, is US-China relations. And there are WTO implications, and there are regional trade implications, and there are bilateral trade and economic implications vis-a-vis China. So all of those come up. I would be interested in each of your thoughts on how our bilateral or regional, but let's say bilateral relationships are evolving in the context of these transformations when it comes to US concerns vis-a-vis China, and if you want to speak to your own government or business community's concerns vis-a-vis China, that would be great too. Was that too convoluted, or does that make sense?
We can jump in. I'll jump in.
Please.
You know that you tried to connect our three comments, and I think the binding line between the three of us is the important role the US plays in all of our economies and the global economy. Because without that US leadership role, Japan may not have come out of its shell, and although Singapore nudged it along, but we were sort of the starter in terms of that economic arrangement. The EU would have been fairly focused within the EU because there's enough going on over there. And in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific, without the US presence, we may not have had some of those elements of economic integration that we wanted to pull through the TPP. The China factor now has become a big factor. The old idea of TPP, APEC, the FT, the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, I think these are not something that are going to happen in the very near future. We wanted to bring together an economic architecture in our region that combined the US with its leadership and its innovation and entrepreneurship with the large Chinese economy as well, bringing in others in that whole sort of relationships. That is no longer a realistic option. Then the countries of particularly the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific have to organize themselves a little bit differently. We've got IPEF, for whatever that is. We have the CPTPP with, again, I credit the Japanese leadership for making sure the TPP transformed into the CPTPP, and we've been able to ratify the agreement that others want to join, including the UK and China and Taiwan all want to come into that agreement. We have RCEP, whatever standard that is, because people say it's a lower standard agreement, but it sort of rationalizes work. We've got ASEAN, we've got APEC. So there's a whole noodle soup of arrangements in the region. The US is in some, the Chinese are in some. For us, being in this architecture that brings in everybody into this soup in some fashion, and then you've just got to organize within the reality of geopolitics today. And if US-China relations are in this fraught state, it does make it more complicated. But in a way, it depends on decisions made in Beijing and Washington. How widely and how narrowly are they going to define economic security issues? The export controls that each side puts on each other, how wide are they going to be? How narrow are they going to be? And they can be fairly narrow if you look at what National Security Advisor Sullivan said, you know. High fences, small yard. We've got to see how that really works out. Then the rest of us will organize ourselves around that sort of world. Because none of us are going to step away from doing trade and business with the US, and none of us are going to step away from doing trade and business with China. Because there's a big economy there, there's a big economy here, that, and particularly in the Asia Pacific, where the lines, the supply chains will go through each one. Whether they also include Singapore or Vietnam or Indonesia and the Philippines, they will go through these countries of the region. So we're not going to decouple. We do not see a world of decoupling happening, but we do see some separation in some of the more sensitive areas.
Thank you.
I can subscribe fully to what my Singaporean colleague said. No, I think you are very right in this. And of course, it's hard to keep track of this noodle soup and all the arrangements. But it is important that we are all connected in this sense, because it is truly a global market, also looking at just the industrial base of Sweden. I think one question that we get a lot from our American friends is how do we, Europe or other technology-savvy countries, compete on the global market for technology, for instance, where we realize now that we have our financing mechanisms aren't really there. So are we going to subsidize our companies going into the African market, or are we going to find other ways? Because, for instance, our Chinese friends, Huawei has covered all its fixed costs already on their home market because it's such a big market. So these are things that I think we will have to get to in the future. If we are serious about security and technology and investments globally. And this is a really hard nut to crack, I think. But this is something we need to get to. So I think there's, as I said before, the more we can really work together, it is complicated, and completely understand the whole globalization debate. We have all seen it. We've lost jobs to other countries. But at least what my country has been trying to do is to realize that we won't get those kind of jobs back. We are a high-end technology-savvy country. So what we must do now is educate our population to get into those jobs. We will not ever get back the more putting components together jobs. They are lost for us. So we have to find our new market niche. And this is, of course, a transformation that's hard to make. But if you look at the northern parts of Sweden, which has been losing all the jobs and nobody wanted to basically live there, etc., it's booming now because we have a lot of energy there. So our new battery companies are up there. We are going for fossil. We have the first fossil-free steel in the world. We have a program it's called Fossil Free Sweden. It's 22 different business sectors that have come together with support from state actors as well to do roadmaps on how they would decrease their fossil footprint, which means we are going for fossil-free cement. So it drives a lot of technological developments and climate-friendlier things. And it's happening in this part that was basically desolate before. So it is possible to transform, but it takes time.
Well, and I would note that I've had the privilege of being involved from time to time in Swedish government and business interaction, and it's a really very impressive, very adult kind of interaction. I would ask a follow-up, because I think your comment about, we haven't talked much about the WTO, and I know if we have time, we should do that. Your comment about third country markets and subsidies and the impact is very well taken, because there's a huge gap in terms of global rules of the road when it comes to third country markets and dumping in third country markets and subsidization into third country markets. And we have not figured out how to come to grips with that. And I think that's a point that's very, very well taken.
Just a small comment that I wanted to add, which is the question of the discourse in this town, especially about trade. And I beg to differ slightly from Ambassador Mirapuri's observation that this is a non-starter, this is not a political reality. Because if you look back history, from the repeal of Corn Laws and the Luddite destruction in the Victorian period, trade has always been the underdog. It was always at the mercy of politicization. And we talk about the costs and the sacrifices and the downside of having to open up, liberalize, but at the same time, I think there is ample room for politics to to explain the positivities and the benefits at the same time. I think what is needed, what is required is the true political sort of leadership and courage. So, of course, for what it's worth, Japan, we will try to sort of argue for the case of a strong leadership that we look to coming from the United States. And we would also would like to state that if U.S. really wants to compete with China, this strategy will not be complete without a proper trade policy. So that would be the most forceful argument I would submit. And I think the trade line would definitely unite the Indo-Pacific countries to this common cause and determination to write new modern rules in this region.
That's a really good, I'm not sure you're actually disagreeing with each other, but I think that's a very, very good point. And anybody who looks at polling data, survey research data, will see over the years that if U.S. politicians, Republicans and Democrats, if you get behind the crowd on trade policy, the crowd gets anti-trade. If you get in front of the crowd and you're pro-trade as a politician, the crowd follows you. And it's really quite interesting to see. Now that takes political leadership, takes political courage, but there's evidence that that happens and is doable if it's a priority. And the question is whether that intersection between economic security and national security, the broader definition of geopolitics, will bring politicians forward. Senator Crapo this morning would suggest that may in fact be the case. I am not supposed to editorialize, but you all are terrific. Any one of you could come and teach my course at the University of Maryland. Let me close because I'm looking around the room. If anybody has a burning question, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep rolling here. I see a burning question. Somebody can tee up the microphone, and meanwhile, I'm going to ask one question of Ambassador Olafsdotter, which is a bit of a follow-up from your earlier point. If you had to pick one or two lessons that and I shouldn't talk about the EU, but European businesses and perhaps European governments have taken away or are taking away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that may be applicable or they may see as applicable to China, what would that be? Or maybe...
Well, that's a very difficult question because the Russian economy and the Chinese economy are, of course, completely different. Russia, if you generalize, has been a natural resource economy, and we have had huge investments there. We've had up till the war started about 400 Swedish companies. And so we have really, and it's a big market in itself, but it's of course not comparable to the Chinese market. So that's difficult to compare in the sense. But what is, of course, and has been revealed, but it was already there before, and I think the United States has been very vocal about it, that some European countries have been very dependent on energy, or a lot of countries very dependent on a single source energy, import from Russia, and how that is very vulnerable, of course. My country, we are lucky because we have 40% nuclear, 40 hydro, and renewable, so we didn't really have any, we had no dependency on it, but a lot of countries have, and it shows how vulnerable we can be, particularly when we are dealing with a country that's acting like Russia. So I think this is lesson learned, and as I said, it is also a chance to make a transformation faster. And I think it's very important or interesting to see the whole nuclear power plant debate in Europe right now. In my country as well, we are expanding because also a lot of our new industries demand a lot of energy, which we didn't really have before. I mean, more traditional industries didn't need that amount of energy. So it's, in that sense, also a changing world, where all this comes together.
Thank you. Did you get the microphone?
Thank you. Jean-François Wettin with MEDEF, fantastic roundtable. And I'm going to follow up on what very interesting comments made by Ambassador Tsukada, because when the WTO was created, I know I was there, it was totally distinct from foreign policy. It was out of the question. Now, we are in a world where trade policy is connected or even secondary to foreign policy and national security policy. Doesn't that mean that the WTO should now rest in peace?
Wow. Jean-François, that was a burning question in more ways than one. So let's finish up with a conversation about the WTO. The multilateral or plurilateral platform and your thoughts about prospects for the WTO going forward.
Can I just briefly comment on that? Well, when I said trade policy is increasingly taking on sort of foreign policy overtone, my intention was not so much that it's become a foreign policy tool, trade policy, I mean, but what I meant was that there is more sort of foreign policy factors which need to be taken into consideration when forming trade policy. So I think there is still a valid sort of argument to ensure that a robust, sober trade policy continues to govern discipline. Govern international transactions. But one aspect which I really am worried about in the current WTO or the past few decades in WTO is the, it's nothing confidential, the sort of politicization, if you like, the usual bifurcated north-south division and how should I say, the subjugation of the sort of dispassionate trade discussion to those political discussions. So that doesn't mean that trade policy is dead or WTO has lost its meaning. It's the question of how we can minimize those political noise, if you like, to its minimum level so that we can engage in dispassionate, sort of serious trade talks and encourage this momentum to create this idea of a new wave, a new round of liberalization.
Very, very, very well said. Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam Ambassador.
Well, I guess all these international organizations that have been around for decades, they are as dead as we want them to be, I guess. For smaller countries like mine, the international rule-based world order is paramount for our security and for a level playing field, etc., because that's what we have. Otherwise, it will be the bigger players who dictate out of their own necessities. And I know this sounds very, again, kind of easy. It's easy to say it, and I know it's very hard to do reforms in the WTO, etc. And it has become more politicized. But that's why, for the reasons of predictability, stability, and the smaller countries also chance to have a kind of safe space, if I can call it that. These are very important organizations, and that's why we, a country like mine, have been driving so hard for the reforms of, for instance, WTO, so that it becomes a more modern, functioning organization. I don't know if that case is lost or not, but we are really hoping it's not, because we need that. It's important.
No, I'm with you on that. Thank you. And Ambassador Mipuri, you raised the WTO in your opening comments. Why don't we close with your thoughts on the WTO?
As an even smaller country than Sweden, multilateralism and global trade policy is so important. You have to juggle everything. You juggle bilateral arrangements, and for big countries like the US, bilateral arrangements is where you can twist arms. And that's why big countries like bilateral arrangements. For smaller countries that are the subject of this arm twisting, we like some of the predictability of international rules and norms. And the WTO gives us some of these international rules and norms. Would we have designed it that way as we look back 20 years? Maybe we would have made certain changes along, we should have changed it along the way. Foreign policy is in every multilateral organization. Whether you look at the Security Council, now stalled because of the Russian veto on many issues, foreign policy is there. But Singapore or Sweden or Japan is not going to give up on the WTO. In fact, Singapore and Japan and Australia are working on the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. Singapore's just ratified, the second country to ratify the fisheries agreement in WTO. We put a lot of effort into that. We're not going to give up on that, even as we look at other regional and bilateral arrangements. I think we've got to find a way in which we can do all of these things. Some will work, some get stalled temporarily because fashion changes, foreign policy issues intervene, but we can't afford to give up on them. We haven't spoken about, besides WTO, is climate change. Where is that organization if we don't get some of these arrangements into even the WTO? How are we going to talk about some of these areas which are so important for sustainability? We're talking about today's problems to be dealt with today. What about the future problems? And many of these will need multilateral organizations like the WTO to talk about it. So we're not giving up on it. And we need the US to be as focused on it as the rest of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking this magnificent panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to the ambassadors. You'll just bear with us for 1 second. And I don't want anyone to get out of their seats. I know you can smell the lunch, but we're going to make you just sit still for 1 second. You mentioned the WTO fisheries agreement. While I was sitting here, I wrote my trade Valentine on this one. So there was a fisherman from Nantucket. His fish stock kicked the bucket, but the WTO stepped in, negotiated a fisheries agreement all in, and his crop came back to market. So I hope you're all doing your hashtag Trade Valentines and posting those online. We'll post them for you if you haven't already. Want to do some thanks real quick, if you'll just bear with me for a second. Thanks to our sponsors, Amazon, the National Pork Producers Council, Trade Data Monitor, UPS, Business Roundtable, General Motors, American Apparel and Footwear Association, E&Y, S&P Global Market Intelligence, and the National Retail Federation. All their logos are over there. Thanks as well to the WITA interns and team, Maya, Aaron, Megan, Shannon, Allie, the AAFA volunteers, Ryan, Allison, and Sophia, and of course to Diego Añez, our partner here. Thanks as well to Trade Center Management Associates and the International Trade Center at the Ronald Reagan Building, who support all our in-person activities here at the Reagan Building. So with that, we're going to end our online broadcast. Thanks to those of you who've been watching on Zoom for the past 2 days. Thanks to those of you who joined us on Zoom yesterday. We do have lunch for those of you here in the Reagan Building. You can smell it out in the atrium outside, so please go get your lunch, bring it back in, enjoy some trade networking and some trade Valentines. Thank you all for joining us this year.